Thanks again for accepting to talk to us, to be in that dialogue with us on leadership. Would you mind introduce yourself?
It's a pleasure to spend some time with you. I would say if I were to define myself broadly, it's about how can I drive positive change in the world? And I do that in a number of places. I do that at the University of California and numerous other institutions I teach in around the world. I've done that as an executive in Fortune 100 companies such as Sony, and in numerous startups that I've been a part of, either as a founder or an investor or a mentor over the years. And I currently teach innovation, entrepreneurship, and leadership at UC Berkeley, and work with executives around the world, and also work with students that come and study in my programs at UC Berkeley and launch companies. And there have been hundreds of ventures that have come out of my classes and programs, some of which have gone on to be quite successful, and many of which, as we know, have ended up making holes of various sizes in the ground when they landed.
So that's interesting that you focus on that positive change and then go to innovation entrepreneurship. Do you think that's the main or one of the main levers of that positive change?
I think entrepreneurship is an incredible lever for positive change because it allows people to do several things. First of all, for them to see a need or an opportunity that exists out there, whether they've experienced it themselves or they've identified it through a number of different ways or experiences, and then to go out and do something about it. And what the entrepreneur does typically is they don't try and address this by themselves. They know that in order to make a big positive impact, they have to assemble resources. So part of what I really focus on is identifying the right problem that you're looking for, and then assembling the right resources, team, capital, partners, customers, all of those elements to be able to make it happen. And whether you're launching a for-profit venture, which has been an area that I personally have been involved in quite a bit, or a social venture, because I teach social entrepreneurship in the Goldman School of Public Policy and in our Masters of Development practice, all of those become the opportunity to make positive change happen.
So that's your driver.
Mm-hmm. So how do you define innovation and entrepreneurship? Because there are a lot of different ways of looking and thinking about it. I'm curious to hear your definitions.
Yeah, I think that's a great question because many times people lump innovation and entrepreneurship into one kind of messy ball of spaghetti, right? And they're related, but at the heart, they're really different. I mean, innovation for me is about doing something new, different, better, coming up with ideas around process or product or service, kind of gaining that insight and doing the work. Entrepreneurship is how you put that innovation to work. So entrepreneurship very much is the active phase of taking these new ways of doing something and creating value for your customers, creating value for your company, and how you do that.
And Silicon Valley, of course, is a massive innovation and entrepreneurship machine that's been successful beyond measure, we could almost say, and more so at least than we've seen in Europe in the tech sector, over the past few decades. And I'm wondering, because I know you travel, as you said, internationally, and you've taught around the world. So what is it that in Europe we do not realize or understand that's been so key to the success of Silicon Valley?
So I think I'll start with the glass half full rather than half empty. And that is, having grown up in Silicon Valley, having launched, numerous startups myself, I mean, this is part of my personal DNA, having been here. And, it's part of what motivated me to kind of share that with others globally. And there are a number of elements, that are here, and we might have a chance to talk about kind of the different elements that make for a great entrepreneurial ecosystem. So if we look at that, I think that this is the granddaddy of entrepreneurial ecosystems. And many people look at Silicon Valley and say, how can I make my company, city, country, region, whatever, like Silicon Valley? And there's a lot of things that we can look from that if we look at entrepreneurial ecosystems, as far as, you know, the people and funding and things like that we can do. But the essence is to maybe borrow the best from Silicon Valley and make it your own. And if you just try and copy what Silicon Valley has without understanding that it took, you know, decades, 100 years for Silicon Valley to happen, go way back to the gold rush, when the gold miners in 1848 and 1849 created this boom or bust culture that exists here in the San Francisco Bay Area. So there's a lot there. But when you try and create your own elements of a Silicon Valley or an entrepreneurial hub, what is it that's unique and special about you, your culture, your people, your skill sets, those types of things, and borrow from that? Now, that said, when I look at Europe, I would say that over the past 15 years, 20 years that I've looked at it, especially over the last 10 years, the entrepreneurial thinking that exists, the willingness to take chances, has grown incredibly. And the entrepreneurial both spirit and capabilities in Europe and elsewhere around the world, especially in key areas, have really blossomed. Now, the epitaph of Silicon Valley has been written. You know, the death of Silicon Valley has been written many times. It's too expensive. It's, you know, there's all sorts of structural issues, you know, things like that. But I think that there's still something left, something magical that's in the water here, in the culture, in the people, where we defy convention and keep trying to do different and new things. So I'm not sure we're quite ready to pass the torch yet to any place.
Well, what I'm hearing, what you say, that's quite interesting, is how you go back in time and talk about the culture. That's, of course, is something that also takes time to be forged, in a sense. And you say, you know, things are getting more open, maybe more exciting in Europe, but that also takes time, I assume, you know, by following that same logic. Right. And I'm thinking, what is it about the mindset then and the culture of the Silicon Valley that's been quite unique and allowed it to blossom as it did?
Well, one of the key things, it's actually the focus of a book that I wrote, is our willingness to take big risks with big payoffs and not being afraid to fail. And if you do fail, having that resilience to pick yourself up again and do it again, maybe based on the insights that you learned. So my book, my publisher would want me to make sure that I mentioned it. My book is The Other F Word: How Smart Leaders, Teams, and Entrepreneurs Put Failure to Work. Right. Is all about that. I wrote it with one of my UC Berkeley colleagues and dear friends, John Danner. And it is really a book about innovation. It's about insights into how we operate, how we think, that will make us better innovators, that will make us better leaders at companies or organizations of all sizes, small, medium, large, and in the public sector, the private sector, elsewhere. So there's really this resilience that we have. Yeah, and it's baked into so much of what we do. Think about the venture capital model. In venture capital, there is, you know, a concept called the power law of returns. And the power law of returns in venture capital says 80% of your returns will come from 20% of your investments. In fact, going even further, you can say 80% of your investments may be either worthless or close to it. But those 20% that succeed, if you make the right bets, can deliver huge returns to a portfolio of bets. So the venture capitalists, and I'm a limited partner in numerous venture capital funds and serve on the investment committee, we look for opportunities that have the potential not to return 2x or 3x, but 20x or 40x if we can. Case in point, one of the investments in one of the funds that I'm involved with just recently had a liquidity event and returned 47x on the investment, which is pretty good. And if that fund were to make, say, 20 investments out of that fund, and all of the other investments were to fail, the fund would still generate a 2.5x, presuming the investments were comparable in returns to those of us who are investors in the fund. So it's that power law that says, look, we're going to shoot big, shoot high, and aim big. That makes a difference. So part of that is baked in to the ethos there. And it's the resilience and also the structure that makes it easy, if you do fail, to pick yourself up again once you've kind of processed that personally and restart.
I'm wondering, when you are in a company trying to innovate, is the situation different? I'm thinking people have their career, they're trying to manage their career. How do you work with that F word?
Yeah, with the other F word there.
The other F word, of course.
Yeah, or that F word, take your pick, right? There's a lot of them. The thing that's really interesting about thinking about, the other F word, thinking about failure and how it might exist inside, how you might have a more productive relationship with it inside large entities, large organizations, is that large organizations actually have the ability to build their own portfolio. And if they recognize that, if they really want change to happen, if they want innovation, if they want big change to happen, new products, new revenue streams, new ways to service their customer, they're going to have to try new things. And the more new things you try and the more ambitious new things you try, some of them will work and some of them won't. And as opposed to presuming that every single one of them has to succeed the way some companies do, if you take a portfolio approach to it and say, what if 1/3 of my new ideas succeed? So I'm going to take a higher percentage hoping to succeed, and 2/3 fail, but I can repurpose the people and resources even in those failures. Then bigger companies, large organizations have the opportunity to get outside of the current loop that they're operating in and create big new opportunities. So I try and encourage companies in their innovation areas, for example, in their labs, in their innovation thinking, to think about things as a portfolio and to actually set the bar for success higher and allow a percentage of their companies to fail. And if everybody knows that only the top third, let's say, of these experiments will be funded on an ongoing basis, then they'll take more risks. So that means more will fail, but those that succeed will actually be operating and thinking like startups and will be able to change the trajectory of companies. So instead of going incremental, this year we do 5% more than last year, maybe some of these will allow you to jump on that exponential growth curve that startups jump on.
I hear that those incubated ventures should have some sort of leeway, enough freedom to operate, because I'm thinking in a traditional, large corporation that executes, that operates, that is focused on operating excellence, for example, that the mindset may be difficult to, may not tolerate actually that kind of experiment that you are talking about.
Well, I think the word you just used is really important, which is experiment. And that's not a word that larger companies often like to think about. They like to think about natural extensions of brands, processes, customer relationships, which of course makes a lot of sense. But if you're going to take that experimentation attitude and you're going to run experiments, then some of them will not come out and validate the hypothesis you started with. Thomas Edison was famous for saying, after failure on creating the light bulb, I now know 10,000 ways a light bulb won't work. Well, eventually he figured it out. Now, he was not the only person doing that. So if he had 10,000 failures, there were 10,000 other failures from other scientists and innovators and inventors at the time. And building on those, they eventually figured it out. And I think that's the attitude that we want to take, that I try and espouse we take internally. Not that every innovation and growth project needs to have that attitude. There are some that are natural extensions of brands or markets or relationships, and that makes sense. But where you as a corporate innovator are facing an onslaught of new competitors in the marketplace that are being funded by, say, venture capitalists that recognize 4 out of 5 companies might fail, you need to take a little of that same experimentation or power law math into account.
Are you advocating, in a sense, an open innovation approach where a company would not only have its own incubator, but let's say invest in a lot of startups outside of their walls? Or are you looking mostly at building that capability within the company?
Well, so it's a combination of both. Open innovation is, a kind of a groundbreaking process that was, coined, created by my colleague at UC Berkeley, Henry Chesbrough. And it is it's a great process. It has changed the way many companies, Procter & Gamble is a great example, have switched from telling people who give them ideas, having their lawyers send them a letter saying, don't talk to us, which they used to do, to saying, please give us your ideas and open things up. And I think that absolutely is one of the ways that we should think about innovating, because at the core, one of the things about open innovation, as opposed to traditional kind of closed innovation, is lifting your head up and looking outside the walls of the organization for new partners, new ideas, and new collaborators. And I think that's part of what I'm talking about. You have to get outside and see what's going on. But even when you're looking at an innovation group inside a company, if you take some of the cues from entrepreneurs and venture capitalists and other players in the startup arena and apply them, including some of the metrics, to the innovation experiments and projects that are going on, at least for a portion of that portfolio, take some bigger risks, recognize you might fail. But if you do get that success, that could actually change the trajectory of the company. That can create entire new lines that are different from the natural line extensions you might be thinking about.
And I would assume that taking that approach you are advocating would entail educating top management about that risk-taking, because the traditional KPIs won't apply.
Yeah, so traditional KPIs don't apply. In fact, when I talk to CEOs and leaders and all they talk about are KPIs, I say, stop talking about KPIs. And they go, no, we measure the company on KPIs. I go, yeah, you measure ongoing businesses using KPIs. KPIs are the metrics by which you can say, are we doing a little bit better than last year? Or we're doing a little worse, let's fix it. But startups don't have KPIs because startups do things that are brand new. So we have to think about milestones instead of KPIs. We have to think about attaining new goals as opposed to slight improvements in existing areas. And I think that changing that mindset, that's one of the key pieces of advice that I give to organizations when they're really trying to rethink their corporate entrepreneurship elements or their innovation elements. And I espouse corporate entrepreneurship is think milestones, not KPI. Use the SMART metrics that we frequently talk about. Specific, let me see if I get my SMART metrics right. Specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. Right. So those elements that are the milestones. And when you hit a milestone, all of a sudden your project is worth more. Mm-hmm. It's not a gradual glide path up or down or whatever. It's a step function in value creation. And when you think about that, especially when you think about the way startups work, once they hit a few milestones, they've hit a step function in their valuation. They've taken a big piece of risk off the table, not a little at a time. Boom, we've attained this. And then they typically are worth more. They can go out and raise more capital at a higher valuation. And they then work to chip away at those next sets of milestones that take other sets of risk off the table. Are you taking customer risk or market risk or execution risk or product risk? What are you doing to take those risks off the table when you first ship your product or when you get your first 1,000 customers or when you do something like that?
I'm curious, how you get those executives who are used to operate a large business to understand that shift in mindset, because here it's about spending time, their time, giving time for those fledgling businesses to develop, dedicating resources. So how do you get them to really understand that deeply?
For me, the most important thing is for them to actually experience it themselves. And we do that in a number of ways. I mean, being at UC Berkeley and in Silicon Valley, I have leadership teams from around the world that come. And there's an element of, oh, I want to go to Silicon Valley to, see Google, Apple, et cetera. And if you can get in and see them, great. But more than that, it's then about introducing them to other entrepreneurs and talking about that shift in mindset. And I use my own experiences as well. For example, I did a corporate startup for Sony a number of years ago. We raised from Sony tens of millions of dollars, and we built hundreds of millions of dollars worth of revenues in a short period of time, but not doing something incremental, inside the corporate headquarters. Rather, it was by starting up our own venture, by bringing in people that were entrepreneurs, not just corporate citizens. And yes, of course, we included a few key members from the corporate team because they needed to look after us, make sure that we weren't breaking all of the rules, just the appropriate rules. And we broke most of the rules. But they kept helping us by providing us with resources, funding, people, access to intellectual property that was inside the organization. How do we navigate a global organization like Sony, and continuing to help us, evangelize or socialize where we were going and get those right people on board. And frequently we would then bring executives out to see what we were doing in our kind of wild, crazy experiment and try and infect them benevolently with this new way of thinking.
Do you think it takes a bit of courage for executives to embrace disrupting their own business?
Yeah, very much. It very much takes courage. First of all, to be an entrepreneur takes courage. You have to be courageous, either that or desperate. And I mean desperate in a positive way. In that, oh my gosh, there's this problem I'm trying to face. For example, when I was at Sony, we'll come back to that. But when I was at Sony, one of the areas that I was charged with, this was many years ago, was running our e-commerce operation. And I went through all of the recommended pieces of software and payment platforms and things that were sent in my direction. And none of them were very good. They really didn't meet my needs. So I ended up working with a bit of a ragtag team of artificial intelligence experts and data scientists and coders, and we built our own e-commerce solution because what we saw out there wasn't that great. And the validation that I got at the time, whether it was speaking at conferences or elsewhere, was people came up to me from other large companies, from the Hewlett Packards of the world kind of thing, big tech companies, and said, "Where did you find that e-commerce platform?" And I said, "I built it." And they said, "Well, can we license it?" So I flew back to Tokyo and said, "I think we have an e-commerce business here." And Tokyo said, "We're not in that business." The board, I presented to the Sony board, "We're not in that business," but they were generous enough to let me spin that piece of technology out. Of course, they retained a license, et cetera. And that actually became one of my first personal startups called WebOrder, which I took through funding and growth. And it's now somewhere inside of Google, many years later.
Very nice.
So kind of going through that. But coming back to your question, does it take courage or desperation? My response is a little bit of both, because I didn't see a good solution out there. And fortunately, I was in an environment at my own startup at Sony that enabled me to take chances.
You mentioned the failures, and you mentioned, once you've processed it. And I'm wondering, what advice do you have for those folks who dare put their neck out and end up, despite the best efforts, failing? How do they pick themselves up to go for the next adventure?
Yeah, so picking yourself up after a failure like that is hard. And part of it depends. So that's a great question. Part of that depends on the environment that you're in. If you're in an environment where people recognize, let's say it's our corporate environment, that 2 out of 3 of our startup experiments, if we're bold, if we have ambitious objectives, might fail. if you're in that environment, then you're able to pick yourself up. You're able to gain insights. One of the most important elements that came out of the research that John and I did in this book, we spoke with hundreds of CEOs and hundreds of other key influencers or people who took chances, people like, astronauts, or put on, Broadway theatrical productions. If you're in a rocket ship, your attitude towards failure very much is failure is not an option. However, when things go wrong, what do you do? So from coming out of all of that, we came out with several insights. One of them is, just like when somebody passes away, there is a process you have to go through to grieve a little bit, to recharge your batteries, to figure out what the lesson was that you learned. Why did you fail? And that's the most important thing. Why did you fail? Was it because you didn't execute well? Was it because the market wasn't ready? Was it because the technology didn't work? The element of timing is so important. Maybe that was it. So maybe you go back and you try something very similar where you change one or two variables, or maybe you recognize it is just not the right opportunity, at least not right now. But you have to go through that process, pick yourself up again, understand what you learned from it, and then try again. And if the organization is willing to embrace that and say, we know, I'll use my same metric, 2 out of 3 of you may fail, give it your best shot, let's learn again. And for those of you who don't succeed, let's try something new. Then it becomes much easier for you to take those chances. Then you have a safe place to land.
I was wondering, could you share a couple of your failure stories?
So a few failure stories. A couple of them around even why I came back and started teaching at UC Berkeley. So I have several degrees from UC Berkeley, and I started my career, and I ended up doing a number of corporate startups, and spun one of those corporate startups out from Sony. As I mentioned, it became WebOrder. I took that through funding and growth, got acquired, and learned so much along the way, almost killed the company a few times, and then came back to the Haas School of Business, where I had gotten a degree in entrepreneurship, and said, it really came back to complaint. And that was my reality. Running a startup, running corporate startups and running a startup was so different from what I learned in the business school when I was a student. And this was many years ago. So I came in to complain, and in their wisdom, as sometimes happens, they said, you're so smart, why don't you come teach? And 20 years ago, I came back then to the Haas School of Business and started teaching entrepreneurship, not from an academic framework perspective, but rather as a practitioner. And I then started sharing, and I'll share one or two good examples. I started sharing some of my experiences and bringing in colleagues that I had worked with, other entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, the attorneys I had worked with, all of them to share the stories of what worked and what didn't from an experiential standpoint. And this was before we had accelerators like Y Combinator or 500 Startups, or even our own UC Berkeley Skydeck, which I helped create at the very beginning, which is a well-regarded accelerator. And we also have our own venture fund, which I'm a part of as well, to do those. But this was before any of that. This was just, we teach what we know. Now, over the past 20 years, having spent time in the halls at UC Berkeley with many really smart colleagues, I've taken those experiences and the companies I continue to work with and the venture funds I work with and built some frameworks around this that really bring together how the real world operates with some frameworks. And I try and keep them simple that entrepreneurs and investors and corporate entrepreneurs and CEOs can use to help change the way that they think about this, and in particular, how they execute in the real world. tools that they can use to determine whether this is a good opportunity, or what the 5 key categories of risk are that they should try and de-risk, or what the elements of an entrepreneurial ecosystem should be. And all of those are kind of tools or frameworks that I try and communicate. But you asked me for an example, and I'll share one. After I sold one company, and we sold it at the absolute high of the stock market, one of the things that my bankers had told me, you have to accept what was called these lockups, these startup lockups, which meant that I owned shares in the company that acquired me, but I couldn't do anything about it. And it wasn't legal for me at the time anyway to hedge them in the marketplace or anything. Well, soon after we sold the company, the stock market took a turn for the worse. And the value of the shares that I owned in the company that acquired me tumbled dramatically. And I would come home and I would tell my wife, we lost a lot of money in the market today. It's like we could have bought a house for the amount of money we lost in the market today, kind of thing. And I would do this day after day as the market kept tumbling. And it's like, well, isn't there anything we can do? Can we stop the bleeding? And I said, legally, I don't think that there's anything we could do. So those are the types of things that it was like. By the way, it takes a while to recover from those. Fortunately, we had a bounce at the end, right? And things ended up okay, not great in that instance, but we learn from those types of experiences. And one of the key things as a result of that was coming back to Berkeley, teaching how it's done, and I do very unconventional things. I bring, for example, attorneys into the classroom to say, how do you work with an attorney, which is something nobody had ever done when I was taking classes. So some of those helped shape a little bit of this resilience that I try and bring through for entrepreneurs, for corporate entrepreneurs, in my book, The Other F Word, and others.
I would like to turn your strong analytical powers, obvious as platform for your great success, and try to turn it inside you and ask you the question, inside your successful entrepreneur mindset, what are your key strengths? What words would you put on your key strengths?
Yeah, the personal elements. So there are several for me that I think really, I keep a list of my top 10 kind of entrepreneurial mindset elements. For me personally, I think there are 3 or 4 that are really important. One of them is a real bias to action. Yeah. Entrepreneurs have a bias to action, right? And we have a bias to action in spite of not having personal kind of perfect information. Because in rapidly changing marketplaces, if you wait for perfect information, then you will be too late. That perfect information may never exist. So you have to make high quality decisions quickly and move quickly in rapidly changing markets. And that's what entrepreneurs do. I think that another trait that I feel really strongly about, and I try and communicate similarly every day, is we have to be optimistic.
Yes.
Even in spite of the fact that more startups will fail than succeed, the optimistic entrepreneur is the one that is able to attract key employees and customers and funders, because we show the pathway through our optimism of how we are going to navigate all of those issues that we might encounter. I think that, so for me, that's very important. I also think we have to be willing to break a few rules. There's an expression, ask for forgiveness, not permission. And that's another element that I think an entrepreneur really needs to embrace. And it's not just startup entrepreneurs. Startup entrepreneurs break the rules, but it's corporate entrepreneurs as well that have to be willing to break some rules. Because if you ask for permission, you know what the answer is. If you feel you have to ask for permission, you know what the answer will be 9 out of 10 times. It will be no. So just do it and figure out a way. And then later on, somebody says, we never would have given you permission to do that, but we're so glad that you took that chance. Those are elements from an entrepreneurial mindset component that are really important.
So what characterizes you is courage, impatience as well? You highlighted the willingness to step quickly ahead and forward. Are you impatient?
Yeah. So I think that there has to be an element of impatience in there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a bias to action is that itch that has to be scratched. It's that I see a better way. Maybe we'll turn that around. There's impatience, but how do we drive positive change? That's where we started. And if I see the opportunity to drive positive change, why am I going to wait to make that happen? Whether it's commercial change or societal change. So impatience is part of that. I think that's a great word. One of the other things that I think is a misconception that people often have is branding entrepreneurs and venture investors, early stage venture investors, as risk takers first and foremost. And I think that there is a lot of risk involved. Clearly, there's risk involved. But one of the things that we've done through studying startups and what succeeds and what doesn't is we understand the path. And rather than branding us, me, as a risk taker, what if we reframe it as a risk manager? If we know what the key elements of risk are, I simplify them into 5 very simple buckets. One of them is product risk. Can you build the product? Does the technology work? The second is market risk. Is there a big enough marketplace? The third is execution risk. Do you have a team that can execute, that can hit your milestones? The fourth is financial risk. Do you understand your business model? Are you asking for the right amount of money? Those are the 4 core ones. And then if you're in a regulated marketplace, it's regulatory, legal, those types of elements. If we use those 4 big buckets, there's many more, and step by step, we take actions to take all or some of those risk elements off the table, and we allocate funding and resources based on our ability to de-risk the venture along the way, there's a much more methodical process than people give entrepreneurs and investors credit for.
No, I mean, it's very closely connected to your that you're so occupied with failure, dealing with failure, managing failure, describing failure. Could you remember a feeling you had when you yourself, you mentioned before examples of failure. What feeling does it create inside you when you are facing a failure? Do you remember that?
There's a certain element, and this is where you have to step back, of panic that sets in.
Panic.
Because there's an element, and you have to avoid that. Because when you panic, you make bad decisions. So it's so important for me to have these somewhat simple frameworks, including the framework that I laid out in The Other F Word, in my book, The Other F Word. There's a way for us to process this so that we don't lock up and either do nothing, which is often the worst thing to do, or do the wrong thing. There's a way we have to process either an impending failure so that we can avoid it, or one that we're right in the middle of so we can minimize its risk and we can gain the insights from that. And if we step back just a little bit, kind of move out of body for a little bit and take a deep breath and use some of these frameworks to identify what's happening, then we can navigate these particularly well. And first, let me share with you a little bit this framework that I'm talking about from The Other F Word. Is we have 7 stages. I'll go through them really briefly, but it's a way to process what is an impending failure and how you might address it. So first of all, we have to recognize failure happens a lot. And that's one of the things where some companies say no failures can happen at all. So we have to recognize failure happens a lot. So that is to respect failure. And then we want to rehearse for it. Sports teams, doctors in the surgical center, they rehearse for it all the time so that when something happens, they immediately know how to respond to it. So we rehearse for it, we recognize it early.
And
then
that's
when
what
it
you are
happens,
doing yourself personally? How do you rehearse for dealing with failure
well,
personally?
yeah, that's a great question. One of the things that businesses don't do, most businesses actually don't think about this. That's part of the reason I wrote the book.
Yeah.
Right. But because if we think about other disciplines like engineering, they have an entire discipline around failure analysis. Let's try and make this bridge fail, at least in our engineering drawings and in our calculations. Businesses often don't. We frequently don't do drills the way fire departments do drills. What if a failure happened? Because we don't like to think about it.
I worked with a company who used the Swiss cheese model to avoid failures, to analyze what would be the next pitfall, the hole in the cheese, and how to avoid next hole in the cheese, how to avoid constantly.
Well, that is an enlightened business, because many businesses don't do that. One of the things that I always advocate for is to do things. It's almost like war games. Can you have war games, which is take your group and split them in half. One of them is the competition and they're attacking you. What would they do and how would you respond? As an example, to build up that quick response that you get. But one of the most important things, even if you get that far and the failure happens, is many businesses try and fix it right away.
Yeah.
Of course. Yeah. And I don't encourage that. Before you go ahead and bandage the wound and cover it up, take a look inside and say, how did we get this in the first place? Exactly. What did we miss?
Exactly.
And if you can figure that out, that's the big takeaway, because you've already paid the price for that failure. Your customers have left you. A product has had a terrible malfunction in the marketplace and the regulators are telling you to recall it, whatever it is. How did that happen in the first place? And what can you do to fix it? Boeing, for example, the jet company, has had a lot of those recently. The most famous one that we can think of is the 737 MAX problem, where, as it turns out, their engineers knew that there were problems with the control system that ended up crashing 2 jets and killed hundreds of people. But they had a culture that said, cover it up. We don't want to hear about that. So Boeing has, and then they've had more and more issues. Right now, they have problems with some of their suppliers. The wings on the 787, they have problems attaching the wings to the jet. I don't know about you. I like my wings attached to the fuselage when I'm on an airplane, right? So those are things where Boeing has had some real issues from a cultural standpoint. And that's where I really encourage people to open it up.
You obviously create commitment and followership via your analytical power and your ability to create a bigger picture and patterns and good explanations. What other tools do you use to create followership apart from the cognitive analytical processes you obviously use?
Yeah. That's kind of the $64 million question, isn't it?
That's
for
good.
leaders. Yeah, that's the big question.
I can assure you it is.
Yeah.
Yes. I work with that every day when I do coaching and leadership training.
I think that you are asking me exactly the right questions to bring that out, which is, tell me a personal story. Tell me a personal example, which you've asked a few times, and I've tried to share both mine and others. If leaders are willing to share personal stories, they create an environment that allows others to take chances, to take risks in this regard. They create trust with their employees because they are not afraid to show that they are human and they've made mistakes as well.
Yeah.
And if you can tell a personal story about something that went wrong, what you learned from it, and how you survived and thrived afterwards, that's important.
Yes, totally agree.
And the concept of storytelling is really important. We all like to listen to people who are good storytellers, who can start at the beginning, surprise us in the middle, and give us a takeaway at the end. And if we can embed some of those personal truths about how we innovated, about how we failed, about how we lead, about our path in a way that makes us human and makes us relatable to our teams, and do so through the arc of a story that doesn't feel contrived, but a genuine story, then we capture people's imagination, and hopefully we capture their trust, and we create that kind of culture inside our company that people want to be a part of.
So it's part of being transparent.
Being transparent is part of it. And as a leader, that's hard, because as a leader, having led a number of organizations myself, from raw startups to not huge organizations, but as many as 2,000 people, so still a lot of people, there are natural tendencies to throw up barriers, because a lot of people want to see how fallible you are, or they want to take your place, or whatever else it is. So I think as leaders, we have to choose our moments. And for those of us, and I expect many of your listeners are among those people, for those of us who have been the leader of an organization of whatever size, we realize that while we may have key other colleagues that we work with, being in that role can sometimes be a lonely place, and there's a natural response to throw barriers up to protect ourselves. And it's the strong leaders, the strongest leaders, that are willing to be at least somewhat transparent, to show yourself in. I don't think you can make yourself too vulnerable as a leader. There are times when you
It's a
do,
balance.
but not all the time. There's a balance that we need to strike,
Yeah.
to strike strong leadership, but also that we're communicating our personal values in a way that hopefully the rest of our colleagues and teammates and employees can see that and want to be a part of that culture.
That's why, from my perspective, being a leader is not a born capacity. You can learn it because you can grow your self-awareness. You are right now talking about a self-awareness in the moment, in the situation, in the role, and how important it is to kind of fit into the given context. But having that self-awareness also called for some courage. And yes, but I totally fell in love with your Be Prepared kit. Do you remember the you have this tool of
I do. Yes.
It's so
You're talking
beautiful.
about my bag of Be Prepared items.
I love it.
Yes.
I took a copy of it. But then I came to think, okay, this is your practical Be Prepared. What are your mental Be Prepared kit? Probably we don't have time to elaborate on that, but what are your kind of mental strengths prepared kit that you really need to, as you said, to drive positive change in the world? What are your mental prepared kit?
That's a great question. I was having a conversation with somebody recently who complimented me on kind of how easy I seemed to navigate a somewhat challenging situation. And I commented to them that making it look easy isn't. And there aren't specifics in that, because every situation is a little bit different. But as a leader or as a contributor, whatever end of your career you might be on, I do think that putting in the work, thinking through what could go right and what could go wrong, having your checklists, which are really important. We all develop our own checklists for whatever it is we'll be doing, giving a talk, launching a new venture, whatever it is, doing due diligence on an investment. We all have our checklists. But if you put in the extra work, if you don't just assume you can show up and wing it, For me, that's the equivalent of it. And I think that each of us will have a different prepared kit, our own kit, our own mental kit of how we approach it. And if we're disciplined and we give ourselves time up front to think about what might go wrong and rehearse for those things, and perhaps take some extra steps up front to ensure that at least a few of those that we can control won't go wrong, by checking in early, by doing whatever, then we limit the number of variables. And of course, we can handle some of those as we go through the process. It's when we have too many things that go wrong that typically overwhelm us.
So a very important thing in your mental toolkit is courage, the courage to admit that there is a huge failure risk to fail. And you don't kind of ignore it or push it out. You look it right in the eyes and deal with it. And the underlying dynamic in that is, from my perspective, courage.
I think that's a good word. That's probably, that might even be a bigger word than I might use. But I like that word. And for leaders to think about that. And I don't think courage comes from one place. Courage comes from doing the work up front as well, understanding the variables that you're facing, not walking into an arena filled with lions where you haven't figured out how to at least address some of those elements. And when you know how to address some of those elements, it gives you that confidence. It gives you that courage to go in knowing that there will be some variables you may not be able to control, at least yet. And then you address them.